You know what it felt like? It felt like dad strength. You know when you were a kid and you're wrestling with your dad, and he's just taking all the hits and he's toying with you, and then boom, he just takes you down. Jesus setting me straight that day. That felt a lot like that. Okay, I know. Hindsight is 2020, but at that time and at that moment, I just couldn't figure out what he was talking about, I mean, why did he have to suffer? Why did he have to die? No. Not on my watch. This wasn't going to happen. No, sir. It just wasn't like he was thinking straight. I kept thinking maybe he's dehydrated, maybe he's hungry. The man never got enough to eat, if you ask me. So I take him aside and I start laying into him. And before I could even get very far, he stops me, he looks me in the eyes because he has those eyes. And you know what he said to me? Get behind me, Satan. Dad strength. Those words, those eyes. That moment floored me. He floored me. But I mean, seriously, get behind me, Satan. All right, I admit I have some flaws, but Satan, I mean, that stung a bit, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I just didn't get it. I just didn't see the whole picture, which won't be the last time that'll happen, mind you. You see, I wanted him to use that dad strength on the world, I mean, my desires, my plans. And your boy Peter's plans, they don't always work out so good, i.e. ear slicing, etc. But he knew all along. He would give us just enough rope to allow us to figure things out for ourselves. And then he had that dad strength, He'd pull us back in. Right at that moment, we needed saving from ourselves. That was his plan all along. Saving us from ourselves. Saving me from myself.
Well, this morning we're continuing our study. This is week number 2 of our 40 days with Jesus. Walking alongside those who encountered Jesus firsthand. Last week we met John the Baptist, the voice crying out in the wilderness, preparing the way for Jesus. We saw how Jesus' journey to the cross began not in a courtroom on trial, but in the waters of baptism, where he identified with us and he offered us a new beginning. Well, today we meet Simon Peter, if you haven't guessed by now, one of Jesus' closest disciples. If John's message was about preparations, Peter's story was about expectation and what happens when Jesus doesn't meet ours. Have you ever had a moment when you realized someone was far stronger than you thought? I remember growing up and working in the garden with my dad, and I was always amazed at how easy it seemed for him to be able to do the things like hoe the garden and use the old hand plow to dig rows or to run the old tiller through the garden. It always just seemed so easy for him. One time I thought that I would help out in the garden while he was off at work, and so I got out the old tiller to run through the garden. I thought, I can do this. Of course, it was a front tine tiller. You probably know what those are and familiar with those, as many of you know. They're not very easy to use and definitely not easy to control. I think I had made a couple of passes through up and back before I just gave up. It was way too hard of a thing for a kid to do. And I kind of realized, my dad's pretty strong to be able to do this. Well, what was it for you? Maybe it was your dad effortlessly lifting something with which you struggled. Maybe it was a coach or a mentor or a leader whose strength and wisdom took you by surprise. Maybe you've even been that person for someone else, showing up with the strength that they did not expect. That's what we call dad strength. It's not physical. Well, sometimes it is, but it is the assurance that, someone's got you. It's at that moment when you realize you're not alone. You're held up by someone stronger. In today's passage, Simon Peter experiences that moment with Jesus. And, he had been following Jesus around, and, he had seen the miracles. He had listened to Jesus' teaching, but suddenly he comes face to face with a bigger truth. Peter thinks he understands who Jesus is, but then Jesus shows a strength beyond anything he imagined. A strength that does not look like power the way Peter expected. And so Peter has to decide. Will he trust Jesus' strength or rely on his own? This morning, I want us to look at this encounter with Jesus and see what it means for us today. And so as we begin, we first see that the disciples begin recognizing who Jesus really is. In Mark chapter 8, we have the story of Jesus and his disciples walking from Galilee to Caesarea Philippi. Now, Caesarea Philippi was not a place that a lot of people would want to go. It was a place known for its temples to pagan gods. And so, as Jesus and his disciples are walking along, Jesus, is preparing his disciples and for what they would encounter there. And he turns and he asks his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" Well, they gave all kinds of different examples and answers. And, Jesus follows up with all of what they said. And he says, but what about you? What do you guys say that I am? Well, it's not surprising that Peter was the one who just came right out with it, That's the way he tends to do things. And so in Mark 8:29, Peter makes this bold pronouncement. He says, "You are the Messiah." For the first time, one of the disciples declares who Jesus really is. Well, Peter was right, wasn't he? He knew that Jesus was the Messiah, but, he didn't quite understand what kind of a Messiah Jesus would be. Peter was expecting something like a warrior king, someone who would come in and he was going to overthrow Rome and he was going to set things right and he was going to establish power and give Israel the freedom that they really wanted. You see, Peter wanted a Messiah of his own design. We all have images, though, of who we think Jesus ought to be. The lead singer to the rock group U2, Bono, was asked Bono if the claim of Jesus' divinity was far-fetched. And he had an interesting answer of all, that I want to share with you. And so he says, no, it's not far-fetched to me. He said, look, the secular response to the Christ story always goes like this. He was a great prophet. Obviously, he was a really interesting guy. He had a lot to say along the lines of other great prophets, be they Elijah or Muhammad or Buddha or Confucius. But he says, but actually Christ doesn't allow you that. He doesn't let you off the hook. Christ says, no, I'm not saying I'm a teacher. Don't call me teacher. I'm not saying I'm a prophet. He said, I'm saying I am the Messiah. I am God incarnate, Jesus says. And people say, no, please don't be that. Please just be a prophet we can take and we can live with, but don't mention the M word. Because, we're going to have to crucify you. And he goes on, and Jesus says, no, I know you're expecting me to come back with an army and set you free from these creeps, but actually I am the Messiah. So Bono goes on, he says, you're left with this. Either Christ was who he said he was, the Messiah, or a complete nutcase. And I mean, we're talking nutcase on the level of Charles Manson. This man was strapping himself to a bomb, and he had King of the Jews on his head, and as they were putting him on the cross, he was going, okay, martyrdom, here we go, bring on the pain. The idea, he finishes and says, that the entire course of civilization for over half of the globe could have its fate changed and turned upside down by a nutcase. Well, that for me, that's far-fetched. Who do we say Jesus is? Is he just a helper, a fixer, a provider? Is he someone that we just run to when we have problems in our lives? Was he just a good prophet? Someone who taught good ways to live, had good things to say? Or is he more? Is he the Lord of our lives, even when his plan doesn't meet our expectations? You see, Jesus didn't just come to this world to teach lots of good stories. Jesus didn't come to just wander around somehow magically healing the sick and raising the dead. He came so that we might have life. To turn this world and our lives completely upside down. He came so that we might have a true, real relationship with his Father. Do you know him that way today? Is Jesus more than a series of stories from a dusty old book that you have sitting on a shelf in your home? Is Jesus real to you? Is our faith in Jesus or in the Jesus we want him to be? Well, after Jesus caught their attention, Jesus shifts the conversation a little bit. And so the disciples, we will see, will be wrestling with a hard truth this morning. In Mark chapter 8, verse 31, we read that Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead. Now you just wait, hold on one moment. That doesn't sound much like a conquering hero to me. That doesn't sound like a winning king. That doesn't sound like a Messiah who's going to overthrow Rome and set Israel free. This is not the Messiah that Peter was expecting. So Peter jumps into action, as Peter always does. Mark 8:32 reads, Peter took him, that is Jesus, aside, and he began to reprimand him for saying such things. You can hear that conversation, can't you? Can you hear that? Peter says, yeah, Jesus, this ain't going to happen to you. This isn't going to happen. You can just forget about this. You've done lost your mind. You've gone crazy. We're not going to let this happen to you, Jesus. We're here to protect you. We got you, Jesus. We're going to be here. We're going to protect you from all of this craziness. Peter wanted Jesus, you see, to fit his plan, not the other way around. And while Peter's words were bold and strong, Jesus responds in even a bolder, more blunt, stronger way. You see in verse 33, Jesus, it says, turned around and he looked at his disciples. He wanted to make sure he had their attention too. And he reprimanded Peter. And he said, get away from me, Satan. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God. Ouch. Wow. That had to hurt. You see, one moment Peter was speaking the truth. The next, Peter was trying to stop Jesus from the very mission he came to this world to fulfill. Just like the temptations in the wilderness, Satan was doing everything he could to derail God's plan. But Jesus wasn't having any of it. You know, we want a convenient Jesus. We want a comfortable Jesus. We want a great teacher, Jesus. We want the Jesus who loves everyone. We want the Jesus who performs miracles, who heals. But the Jesus who came to die, yeah, we don't want any of that. That's not comfortable for us. That's a picture of Jesus we don't want to see. And that forces us out of the box of being comfortable. But you know, that's exactly who Jesus was. Who he came to be, what he came to do. And without that part of the story, Jesus' life, his purpose, and without those things, you know, we would still be sinking and drowning in our sin without even a hope of being pulled back into the boat of safety. How often do we push back against God's plan because it doesn't fit our expectations? Do we reject God's will because it's not comfortable? Stories told about Timothy Keller, a well-known preacher, author, and he was the founder of the Redeemer Presbyterian Church up in New York City. And he had a very different vision for his life. In the late 1980s, he was an academic and a seminary professor. He was quite content in his role of teaching theology and training new preachers. And so one day he was approached about planting a church in New York City, one of the most secular and challenging places in America to start a new church. Well, he wrestled with the idea. He was comfortable where he was. He had never pastored an urban congregation before. He didn't think he was right for the job. In fact, he initially resisted the call and said, "Nope, I'm not going to do it. Nope, I'm not going to have anything to do with that." He thought God's plan for him was to stay in academia, not plant a church. Why would he do that? He says after much prayer and conversation with his wife and deep wrestling with God, he realized this, and he said, God was calling me to something I would never have chosen for myself. So he submitted to God's work, God's leading, and he moved to New York City. And in the beginning, the church struggled. He had a lot of doubts. It didn't fit his expectation, but in time, the church there grew to one of the most influential churches in our country, reaching thousands with the gospel in a city that many thought was unreachable. Looking back, Keller admitted that if he had followed his own expectations, he would have missed the mission God had for him. You see, just like Peter in Mark 8, Keller struggled with a Messiah and a mission that didn't fit his expectations. Peter wanted a conquering king, not a suffering Savior. Timothy Keller wanted a stable academic life, not the uncertainty of a church planting. But in both places, God's plan was far greater than what either one of them had imagined. Like Timothy Keller, we sometimes push back against God's calling when it doesn't align with our preferences or our expectations. But Jesus calls us, just as he called Peter, to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and follow him, even when it means surrendering our own plans. The question is, will we let go of our expectations and trust that God knows better? Finally, this morning, after all of the back and forth, Jesus ends up calling the crowd that was now gathering around them into the conversation, and he gives us a call to true discipleship. You see, picking up in verse 34, Jesus said, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and the sake of the good news of the gospel," he says, "you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is there anything worth more than your soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." You see, Jesus lays it out clearly. If anyone wants to be my follower, you got to give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. Those are some pretty powerful words to describe what it means to follow Jesus. Let's take those chunk by chunk. You see, give up your own way. You see, it's not about our way. It's not about our will. It's not about our comfort. It's not about our preferences. It's all about Jesus. It's about surrendering to him and his plan for our lives. Jesus says to take up your cross. Jesus isn't telling us that we're to find ourselves hanging on a Roman cross. No, that's not what he's talking about. He's saying that it's about dying to self. It's about putting him above ourselves. It's about getting behind him and following him even when the road is hard and rough. And follow me, he says. Boy, those are simple words, aren't they? Are they? Not really that easy, is it? Simple words, but it is not an easy road to follow Jesus. Satan makes sure of that. The question is, are we willing to follow Jesus no matter where the path leads? There's a story that about a first grade teacher named Linda, and she shares this story about one of the interactions she had with one of her students on the first day of school. Now, there's always interesting first day of school stories. Dee Dee's smiling; she knows. Anyone been around the school system knows that. Well, accustomed to going home at noon in kindergarten, little Ryan was getting his things ready to leave for home when he was actually supposed to be heading to lunch with the rest of the class. And so his teacher, Linda, asked him, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm going home. And his teacher, Linda, tried to explain, well, now that you're in first grade, you have a longer school day. And she said, you'll go to lunch now, and then you'll come back to the room, and we'll do a few more things before you go home for the day. And he just looked at her like, what? That real puzzled look on his face, hoping that she was kidding. And when he figured out that she wasn't kidding, he put his hands on his hips and he demanded, who on earth signed me up for this program? As believers, it's easy to feel like little Ryan when we think about the Christian life, isn't it? The requirements are daunting. Surely you don't want me, Lord, to forgive 70 times 7. You've got to be crazy, right? Surely, God, you don't want me to turn the other cheek when someone hurts me. Surely, God, you don't want me to love my enemies. Surely, God, you really don't mean it to take up my cross. What does that mean anyway? And it isn't long before we look around and we say, who on earth signed me up for this program? But the reward for following Jesus is the paradox of the gospel. Jesus said in verse 35, whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. You see, true life is not found in holding on. It's about letting go. It's found in surrender. Jesus isn't talking about the cost of our salvation. No, he already paid for that. Jesus is talking about the cost of serving him. Jesus is not telling us how to be saved or go to heaven. He's telling us how to save our lives and make the most of them while we're on this earth. In other words, he's saying if you want to really live, then give up your life for my sake. Risk it all for the cause of the gospel. Tyrtaeus, an old Greek poet, once wrote something that was very similar to this. He lived thousands of years before Jesus, and he said, the man who risks his life in battle has the best chance of saving it. The one who flees to save it the most is the most likely to lose it. That's true in modern warfare, we're told. During World War II, psychologist E. Paul Torrance made a study of the top U.S. pilots who flew over the Pacific Ocean. And there was one common trait that he found among all of them. They were all risk takers. Throughout their lives, they kept testing the limits of their abilities, and yet they were highly resistant to accidents, he discovered. In fact, during the war, they suffered fewer casualties than the pilots who were inclined to play it safe. And so Dr. Torrance concluded living itself is a risky business. If we spend half as much time learning how to take risks as we spend avoiding them, we wouldn't have nearly so much to fear in life. Those who play it safe, are actually at the greatest risk. But those who take the greatest risks are actually the most secure. Or as Jesus said it, whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me in the gospel will save it. To what are we clinging this morning that keeps us from fully following Jesus? What do we need to let go of? What are we willing to risk for Jesus' sake? What are we willing to risk to spread the good news of the gospel? Where do we need to deny ourselves and trust in His strength instead of our own? This morning Peter had a choice. To trust in his idea of Jesus, who would be a conquering king, or to trust in who Jesus really was, a suffering Savior. Today we're faced with the exact same choice. Do we want Jesus on our terms? Or are we willing to fully surrender and trust in His strength? You see, faith is not about never struggling. Faith is not about never getting it wrong. Faith is about trusting Jesus, especially when we don't understand. Peter's faith stumbled. It will several times throughout his life. But Jesus still used him to build His church. Are you holding on to control this morning, telling Jesus what He should be doing? Or are you denying yourself, taking up your cross, and following Him? It's time to stop wrestling for control and start trusting in His strength. His dad's strength. Because true life is only found in Him.